My name is Stuart Pemble, and I'm one of the partners in the construction and engineering team here at Mills & Reeve. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on building towards net zero. This is a follow-up to the webinar that we gave in April of this year and the report on building towards net zero which followed it. And obviously, to give it the context, it follows up following the COP26 conference in Glasgow. I'm delighted to welcome as speakers once again Carla Parsons, an associate in Mills & Reeve and one of our ESG experts, as well as Professor Sean Smith, the Chair of Future Construction and the Director for the Centre of Future Construction at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, which is part of the University of Edinburgh. The webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be sent to everyone afterwards. Sean and Carla will speak for about 35, maybe 40 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A afterwards. Please put your questions in the Q&A box that appears on your screen. If we're not able to answer all of the questions, as with the previous webinar, we'll circulate all the questions and the speakers will answer them, and we'll give you those answers as soon as possible after the webinar. With that in mind, over to you, Sean.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks to Mills & Reeve for the invitation to return to what could be described as part two. And we opted, and we thought it'd be useful to have part two after COP. A brief summary of part one, which we covered earlier this year, was around net zero. What does it mean, and what are the common terms, the definitions, and how not to mix up some of the terms which come along this direction of travel. The pace of mitigation required, which we'll touch on again today, but take that a bit further. And certainly we can't do it just with trees. We also touched on not just the here and now and what's happened over the last however 200 or 300 years in the built environment and the retrofit, but also what was happening in the next 80 years to come in global growth. We touched on the GHG greenhouse gas emissions from the sector in the UK, life cycle stages, and the importance of scopes 1 and 2, and also 3 related to supply chains and planning your journey. We hope you'll find both that previous presentation, the report and document that was available, and you can get that in the link which I've provided here on the slide, which will take you to part one. But just to remind ourselves, globally, the construction sector and built environment sector accounts for approximately about 38% of all global carbon emissions. Next slide, please, Stuart. Thank you. So in this part two, we want to briefly touch on the COP26 outcomes, the potential necessity of accelerating our net zero approach, touching on mapping of your organisation and looking at some of the pressures on retrofit versus new build and the material resources requirements to come, the significance of place, both in government policies and other areas, and how that could link in with net zero, charging up the road, which I'll come to at some point, which I won't do physically now, but you'll see why I've put that in. And I'd like to also touch on a non-construction sector, but also related area in terms of waste and recycling, and some interesting studies we did there, and maybe what the construction industry could learn from that. Next slide. So in terms of COP26, there was a cooperation of parties of 200 countries that took part, that you've seen no doubt on the news, and it was covered over the 2-week period. And some of the significant areas that were covered and results of COP26 included the Glasgow Climate Pact, where countries will be required to report their emissions on NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, and this will commence next year in 2022. The Paris Rulebook, which brought together the conformed guidance and agreement on a transparency process, which will hold countries to account as they deliver on their targets. Much was covered in the news about phasing down fossil fuels, although not all countries signed up to that. And the adaptation funds, which were increased to various countries and developing countries, and that planned investment going forward. Also the aspects about protecting special natural habitats, and 90% of the world's forests covered by a pledge from 130 countries. There was also, in some of the other days, there was a Built Environment Day, there was also Transport Day. It was good to hear of what some of the largest car manufacturers are planning to do in terms of where they're taking zero emissions by 2040 or by 2035 in leading markets. However, as some of you will be aware, despite much clamoration for further changes than was actually undertaken at COP, independent experts identified that the policies and agreements which were agreed at COP26 would still hold the world and global temperatures to a rise of 1.8 degrees. And really, to be on the safe side, we need to be at 1.5 degrees or less. Next slide. A couple of points which probably didn't make the headlines so much in the news, but were still positive in terms of what happened at COP, was 154 parties or countries drafted new national net zero targets in the run-up to or during COP. And that represents 80% of all global emissions. In the 2 years when Italy and the UK jointly partnered on the development of the COP26 conference, because it was a two-country partnership, that in the 2 years prior to COP26, only 30% of countries actually had net zero commitments. By the time it came to COP, 90% of countries had now net zero commitments, which was a very positive step forward. Next slide. The scale of the task ahead, though, has not become any less. In fact, it's probably become a bit steeper, as is shown in this diagram, which I also used in part one, which was developed by Robbie Andrew, which shows that if we had started back in the year 2000, how much gentler that slope of mitigation and adaptation and carbon reduction measures would have been. Now we're starting so much later, and to hit the target, it becomes so much more steep. And whilst a lot of focus is on energy and various factors like that, we can't also deny that we need to also look at what's happening in other resources, for example, such as water. Just taking the grid on the right, that represents all water on planet Earth. And that one dark blue square, that 1%, represents the only available drinking water we have on Earth. And as we move from currently a 7.8, 7.9 billion population, and over the next 80 years approach 10.7, 10.8 billion, a significant increase, we aren't exactly accelerating our supply of water. And in fact, the scarcity of water will become even more important. Water in itself also can be quite significant in the requirement and use of carbon, both in its treatment and processing. Next slide. So I would have shown a nice image of probably Luke Skywalker or someone, but I'd like you all to consider yourselves as green Jedis from now on. And as you approach everything you're doing in net zero or towards net zero, or even better, beyond net zero, we have to approach it in a just transition. So we include as many people as we can. We're inclusive, both for people in low incomes, people who have disadvantages in various respects. The economic advantages that also net zero brings for us, a fully decarbonised agenda across our portfolio, both in construction and estates and our future planning of developments, and approaching with an open heart and an open mind how we need to be more innovative. Our net zero demands will cover both policy, procurement, but also how we bring the public with us. We can't do it on our own. And new developments will have to be specifically careful about the integration and work with their supply chains and skills, and we'll come to that just shortly. The retrofit impact will be by far the biggest delivery sector that's to come, and that will put huge pressures on skills. We should be ready to be part of what will be archetype solutions for some of the retrofit of our existing building stocks, because they have specific archetypes which supports a mass rollout of retrofit solutions, both in fabric and also energy solutions. And as a result of the skills pressures in the retrofit sector, the growing significance and importance of offsite for new build. Ongoing and future issues will be the global supply chains, the synergetic delivery of green net zero infrastructure across so many countries at the same time, mass material demands across many countries, and our resilience and future planning for sites, deliveries, and also costs. Next slide. Thanks, Stuart. So taking account of all the different features which a number of you are no doubt, or all of you are all experiencing, are these increased costs linked together by Brexit, but also COVID, and the restarting of the world economy on a green transition pathway, which has forced a lot of demands on raw materials, on manufacturing. That in turn has also provided greater input on transport, and the significance of that, increased costs in site workforce, increased site costs for machinery and plant, And therefore, your original building or development you had planned 2 years ago, looking at it now, some of those costs are maybe up 20, 25, or in some cases 30% across the piece. So it's a difficult task, plus the cost of delays. Next slide, please. But when we look at the retrofit of buildings, taking a smaller nation like Scotland, we will have to do 113,000 homes per year to retrofit to the targets of net zero by 2045. For England, it'll be 850,000 homes per year. In Europe, we'll need to retrofit 11 million homes per year to stay on target. And that's on the basis that we only visit each home, each house, once in that period over that 20, 23 or 28 years to come. Now, that's obviously not really going to happen. We'll probably have to visit them in different waves. We'll do maybe fabric solutions. We then may incorporate energy solutions. But regardless, we are going to be very dependent on a lot of imports for various materials and processes. And that's why innovation across the UK is key to delivering future low carbon heating systems, so we can actually manufacture and produce much of our own systems as much as possible, given the international pressures in the market as everyone transitions through this green economy towards net zero targets. Next slide. This will create huge synergies across the influence of markets in all areas, not just in energy solutions, but also building fabrics, and also that future shift from gas to non-fossil fuel energy systems, particularly for new housing, with no clear optimum alternative solution in place for mass rollout. There are a number of innovative systems, both that major house builders and smaller house builders, and also material product suppliers have now provided. It's now a case of how can we deliver those en masse to support the new housing development shift from gas to non-fossil fuel. The future focus on electrical power systems will also create significant pressures on raw materials, which I'd like to touch on next. Next slide, please. When we look at some of the different heating systems which are out there and different technologies, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, PV, solar thermal, thermal battery storage systems which are there, the role of hydrogen, both in industrial and non-commercial type building estates, which probably has a greater speed of delivery than it would potentially in housing, and also new heating systems such as microwave heating systems, which are coming to the market at the tail end of next year for trials. All of these require different types of approaches, different economies of approach, and also in some relationship, there are similar skills and some of areas brand new skills. But the considerations apart from costs will be what will be their real contribution to net zero in the portfolio of the properties or the building assets and infrastructure that you have. What is their reliability, performance, and efficiency? Are they applicable to houses, buildings, and also flats, as we found some systems are not so conducive to flats and apartments? What about the existing services and pipework that you may be able to link into or not? The ease of install and maintenance is a key issue going forward. Despite the issues of just getting them installed, it's then, do we have the follow-up workforce for the maintenance requirements if we're continuing to use that same workforce for the installation requirements? And also then space utilization and noise. Two systems I'm just showing here. One of them is the SunAmp thermal battery storage. I'll declare that was a spin out and linked to with the University of Edinburgh. And that's a heat battery storage system which can be adopted in housing. I believe it's now been adopted and incorporated in over 600 homes so far, all successfully. The other technology shown there is heatwave, which is microwave heating. And we expect those trials to commence later in 2022 into 23, and all being well, then hopefully future manufacturing in the UK to roll out later beyond that. So there are some exciting systems out there and new systems to come. Next slide, thank you. But one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the imports and exports of key products, particularly in this area. And when we look at the last period up to 2019, which is reported in the BEIS statistics, what's an interesting feature here is so many of these features we are importing more than we're exporting. Whilst it's good to export, it's great, it helps to balance the trade. At the same time, if we look at electrical wiring, interestingly, in the last 3 years of 2017 to 2019, using those full years before COVID hit, on average, we were importing 1.9 billion pounds of electrical wiring. We were also exporting about 860, 870 million pounds worth. But as we degas the grid and move to more electrical approaches and electrical-based systems, so both ourselves and many, many other countries around Europe and internationally will require more and more electrical wiring, in which case you may find that some countries may put more restrictions on the imports or exports of some raw materials, as some countries already have done for raw materials and rare earth materials. And therefore, our delivery of net zero is not entirely in our own hands. Quite a lot of this will relate to how we can both source and access some of these raw materials or product materials and bring them into the UK in time for delivery. Next slide. So when we see our net zero targets and equaling our material needs, most of net zero currently by policy is focused on operational carbon. And whilst the governments have yet to state when and if embodied carbon will be part of that policy, there are many industry organisations, UK Green Building Council, Construction Industry Council, and many other international organisations that are already providing guidance around embodied carbon, about embodied carbon approaches. And that's incredibly useful when you consider that roughly over 50% of the entire carbon footprint of a building or a piece of infrastructure is commonly related to the embodied carbon. Our focus primarily in this few coming years just now will definitely be on our scope 1 and 2 emissions, what we can directly control, both in our assets and also where do we source that energy or electricity or power. But we're already hearing that many of the larger companies are now engaging with their supply chains so they can track scope 3 emissions. Net zero is a medium to long-term delivery schedule. Beyond or advanced net zero would be even better, but we shouldn't rush to install some energy systems without sufficient data or without sufficient testing and specifications, because the last thing we need to do is dissuade your public and put them off if we're having to rip these back out and replace them with something a short time later. So fabric first is key, but there are some energy systems out there which have been used with particular building types, low carbon and renewable energies, which have been found to work well. And the sooner we can get these archetype approaches out for our buildings and assets so we can have mass delivery, the better. Next slide. So I wanted to touch on place, and you may have seen both in the UK government's approach to levelling up, but many local authorities are looking at 20-minute neighbourhoods or N-minute neighbourhoods as they're now being more commonly known. And the changing nature of land and our building usage post-COVID has also focused many city authorities and town authorities to look at 20-minute neighbourhoods, looking at gap sites, how people can remain longer at home if they're working or working close to home, the community services and amenities they have around them. They're then identifying gap sites. How can they then put in the supportive amenities or services or further housing in those gap sites to support those neighbourhoods? It does give an opportunity also, as where some offices will decant and those office blocks become available, to re-energise some of our city and town centres with more housing and flats. But placemaking will be and continues to be a key area of government policy. There are various planning and decision tools which can look at 20-minute neighbourhoods, and the mapping of those future gap sites will be very important, and therefore could be quite a lucrative part and sense of the sector, particularly for modular and off-site, for the delivery into these gap sites where you wouldn't be able to undertake normal site operations. So it also provides an opportunity to put in community or also district heating in some locations for these gap sites, which then may also accelerate the net zero approach. One thing to watch out for, we've always talked about sustainable development in many, many years, but one of the future trends which is growing in importance just now across different domains is regenerative buildings and estates, where effectively you will produce more power and energy that you require, that you basically design and build your future infrastructure and estate with a very much embedded design for deconstruction. So in essence, you're dealing with a zero waste approach for the future end of that building asset in 80, 100 or 150 years, when our future generations decide that they will require those material resources because of world shortages, and you have the ability for them to then utilize that. Next slide, please. Moving away from buildings, one thing to look out for is what's happening on the vehicles front. I'm sure a number of you are. And vehicles and transport now is in a very interesting situation, Well, we effectively have 3 or 4 different technologies which are all competing roughly at the same time. They're at different lengths or stretches down that road that they're traveling, whether they be gas-powered vehicles, which are now using advanced sort of digital displacement type technologies for engines, reducing emissions. You have the area around hydrogen-powered vehicles, EV-powered vehicles, and storage systems. But also, what I would draw your attention to is also EV-powered, where they're using overhead lines, and there are trials currently going on in Germany, where effectively similar to a tram that we're used to in cities, that we're going to power trucks where you actually designate one of the lanes in the motorways where trucks can do this. It's also very flexible because when the truck moves out of the lane, it hasn't lost any power because it's storing that power as it's traveling along. It's constantly being recharged. And there's an article there in case anyone's interested, which I put in. Next slide, please. So in terms of our recommendations of this bit here, before I get to a case study, as we said in part 1, incredibly important to map your changes in net zero delivery. It's probably not a bad idea to look back to 2019 before COVID hit, to look at what were your operational carbon, what was typical of your embodied carbon, what was typical of your construction operation carbon. And versus now, probably commencing from the halfway through this year into next year and mapping across where are you at now and what's changed or what may need to change next. Fabric first plans will be incredibly important in mapping those material needs, and also the search for existing archetype retrofit approaches. These will be coming out. You'll probably start to see these published over the next few months and over the next year to certain building types. And these will be important to help skill up our workforce, allow the material sector to supply the key materials that we require for high demand. And therefore, B2B, those business-to-business relationships, given the existing pressures on supply chains, will be key. Certainly, my strong recommendation is to monitor and track and get involved with trialing what's happening with some of the other types of energy systems which are coming out. Offsite is most likely to increase. I would almost replace likely to, it will increase, and it's going to have to. And are you ready for any new build for offsite? Because the sheer pressure on skills which is coming as we rapidly grow the net zero retrofit sector, both domestic and non-domestic sector buildings, will pull huge pressures and demands on the existing skills base. And therefore, new build has more flexibility to divert into the offsite sector. Next slide. I want to just touch, although it's not construction related, but as you'll see, I'll bring it full circle back to being construction related. We did a small study for Midlothian Council. It's one of Scotland's smallest local authorities. And we were very interested to see what was happening in relation to the recycling of waste from households. Where was it going to, who was using it, into which products, and how much of that waste actually was, of recycling waste, was then moving on to being utilized in those products. And that pile on the left is effectively mixed recycled waste, which goes off to sorters, and that you see in that image. And we found that 94% of the recycling from the local authority residents was going directly into future products and processes. 18 different companies were benefiting from the use of that household waste, and it was going into everything from packaging to water filters for fish and swimming pools. And there were hundreds of jobs that were interlinked to that waste recycling outcomes and the trajectory of where the new products were going. So we were very keen then to look at, okay, well, what does this really mean in embodied carbon and energy savings? Next slide, please, Stuart. So we then mapped what was the embodied carbon saving of the whole range of waste streams which were coming through, from garden waste to food waste to commingled materials for recycling from households. And we found, of course, that the commingled materials was the highest proportion. That wasn't a problem because then it goes to sorters, and if it's easier for Joe Public to throw in a commingling recycling bin and then it's extracted and sorted, then the greater likelihood we will have and receive more of that waste being recycled from households because it's easier for them. Next slide. But in the processes, we looked at the 40.8 kilotons of avoided CO2. In effect, this was the embodied carbon which was not going to landfill. This was the embodied carbon which effectively been saved by the recycling of these products. So when you converted it, it was approximately equivalent of 9,000 annual car journeys, or a car driving 103 million road miles, or that household recycled waste would recharge 5 billion smartphones, or heat the annual energy for homes for 5,000 homes. So that's just a very small local authority and how households can actually contribute to that through recycling. Now let's take the construction sector, which is responsible for 48% of all waste. If we could maximize so much better than we've already done, and I know we've done a lot of great work in that area, but if we could maximize even more of that recycling or reduce even more of our waste, then just taking that small local authority here, the figures that you're seeing here are a drop in the ocean in comparison to what the construction sector could do through recycling and more and above. So thanks very much for listening. I'm sure it's with time for some questions, and I'd like to pass on to Carla. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much, Sean, for your fascinating presentation. And it's very timely that you mentioned the importance of the construction industry and what it can do in terms of net zero. I'm a projects and construction lawyer, so taking on from what Sean said on the more academic principles of net zero, I'm going to look at some of the practical considerations around net zero, particularly following COP26. So I'll look at the importance of the construction industry, some considerations around funding, and also looking at the project lifecycle of a construction project. Next slide, please, Stuart. So first, I just want to follow on from what Sean said by touching on the importance of the construction industry in the drive towards net zero. As Sean said, 40%, almost 40% of carbon emissions are from the built environment. So this means that construction absolutely needs to take a leading role in getting us to net zero. And at COP26, one of my key takeaways was just how intrinsically linked the construction industry is to everything that has to be done to get us to net zero. So, for example, many of the commitments and pledges that were made were linked with construction. So whether that was financing to enable some of the more developing nations to improve their resistance to climate change, or whether that was something like the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, where 4 out of the 5 key areas flagged by Boris Johnson related to the construction industry: green steel, green hydrogen, transport, and power. And we also saw at COP26, there was a Built Environment Day. And as far as I'm aware, that's the first time they've ever had a day fully focused on the built environment. Now we're still to see what the legislative landscape looks like coming out of COP26. Of course, we have heard there's going to be a sustainability standards board set up, but we haven't got any legislation immediately on the back of COP26, as you would expect. However, as Sean did flag, there's been some very helpful guidance which was published during COP26. So 2 I would flag to you are the UK Green Buildings Council's Whole Life Carbon Roadmap, and it has information and details for specific sectors and specific stakeholders as well, and it's very detailed. And there's also the Construction Leadership Council's Construct Zero. So while we don't have any specific legislation in place, there is some guidance that is really helpful for construction projects, and whichever part of that construction supply chain you sit in, there will be something for you. Could you turn to the next slide, please, Stuart? So some thoughts on funding. So one of the real trends we've seen in the past few years about funding is that more and more funders and investors have been investing in projects or making commitments to projects that align with their values, and that's ESG values, environmental social governance values, including net zero. So a good example is the Deliveroo IPO that didn't achieve what it was hoping to because of its ESG record. Now that wasn't net zero, that was relating to its employment record. But many major asset investors refused to take part in the IPO because of ESG concerns, and that was publicly stated. And on the reverse side, you have NatWest saying they're going to invest more in social housing. So looking specifically at net zero and COP26, during COP26, we saw a public commitment to net zero from many financial institutions through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which has over 450 financial firms and $130 trillion committed to net zero. Many insurers, banks, and asset owners have made equal commitments to achieving net zero through the Net Zero Bankers Alliance, the Net Zero Insurers Alliance, and the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. And these firms are publicly committing to achieving net zero, which means that if they're going to invest in projects, if they're going to commit funding, they will have net zero requirements. So if you're looking to enter into a project, if you're looking to get funding, it's really worth thinking about what are your net zero plans? What are your net zero targets? How are you working towards that? And by having some sort of net zero pathway in your organization, you will open yourself to greater forms of funding. So some of the less traditional funding vehicles, for example, green bonds, blue bonds, or the social bonds market. Funders also have various protocols and standards, commitments and obligations they will have signed up to. For example, the UN Principles of Sustainable Investment, the Principles of Sustainable Banking, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment, or the Equator Principles. They will all have requirements to take into consideration risk and to disclose. And the EU taxonomy regulations will also require financial institutions to disclose on climate-related issues. Therefore, if you are already considering net zero, if you're looking at it in the context of your project, you are more likely to get funding and to be somebody who's attractive to funders. Can we have the next slide, please, Stuart? So I'm now going to touch briefly on the different stages of a project lifecycle, starting with the bid and tender stage and coming to the end of life. So starting at bid and tender stage, if you are looking for people to come and tender for your project, be really clear on what your net zero requirements are early on. This means you're more likely to get a range of bidders who are appropriately looking at those requirements, appropriately pricing in considerations around materials, labour, getting the right certifications, and so on. And if you, on the flip side, are somebody who wants to bid for a project, think about what your experience in this area is. Do you have the appropriately skilled people? Do you have the right procedures and practices in place? Do you have net zero policies? Do you have people who are dealing with net zero in your organization? And it's going to become more and more common that there will be a requirement to have net zero plans if you are bidding for something, and particularly with government projects. For example, it's now a requirement that projects over 5 million, you will present a carbon plan and you'll keep that updated. So then once you've chosen your bidders, or once you've been chosen as somebody to enter into a contract, it's time to think about what do you do with that contract. So engage early. Don't think of net zero as a tag on at the end. Think about how it runs through every stage of your contract. Firstly, how are you defining net zero? Make sure there's a common understanding. As Sean mentioned earlier, there's the different scopes. So do you expect scope 1 and 2, or do you expect scope 1, 2, and 3? What will you expect your contractors to report on? How are you going to audit that and measure? Will you have any incentivizations for people in your supply chain to achieve net zero? The Chancery Lane project is a really good resource for clauses relating to net zero. If you haven't seen it, it's a group of lawyers who have come together to create green clauses that can be included in contracts. And these are incredibly useful for thinking about passing your net zero obligations up and down your supply chain. But obviously, as a reminder, don't just drop them into your contracts. Do take legal advice on how you make them appropriate for what you're doing. So then moving on to your build. Your build is the point at which your real carbon intensive activity starts. So it's thinking about how do you reduce that carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions as well as possible and in as many areas as possible. So that's thinking about, for example, materials. As I mentioned before, green steel was mentioned in the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, but green cement is also a growing market. And can you source those materials locally, or do you want to put requirements on your contractors to do so? Is your labour appropriately skilled in net zero? Do they understand what they're doing? Where is your workforce coming from? What transport are you using? Are you using modern methods of construction, modular methods of construction? Are you doing it on-site or off-site, as Sean said? And how will your build achieve any certifications you want it to achieve? These are all things that should be put in your contract. These are things that you should think about early on, but there's always more you can think about doing. And you need to think of your build in a holistic way to make sure you capture this all appropriately early. And then the life of a building. So while we may think we achieve net zero once the building's up and running, and that's it, net zero really needs to continue throughout the life of the building. So how will you report on what your building is doing? Think about potentially doing an audit throughout the course of the life of your building, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 5, 10 years down the line. Do you want to incentivize your tenants, for example, through their leases, to be more sustainable and have lower carbon emissions? Could you incentivize your facilities management companies? And it's really worth thinking, again, in your terms of your project holistically, that where is your project based? What utilities are you using? Because these are various considerations that if you don't tackle at an early stage, means that your carbon emissions will be greater. For example, if you are a distance away from public transport, will people have to drive to your building? And therefore, have you got sufficient spaces for electric vehicles, for example? What utilities providers are you using? And so on. There's lots of considerations that are worth thinking at the outset that will make sure your project is net zero. And then the end of life of a building. Is it really the end of life? As Sean pointed out earlier, we need to make sure that we are retrofitting as well. Retrofitting is key to getting to net zero. And there are some incredibly good examples of retrofitted buildings. For example, the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership has one of the lowest carbon buildings in the world, and it's a retrofit as well. So there's lots of things that can be done with retrofitting to make sure you're achieving net zero. And I think we've now reached the end of the building's lifetime. So I'm going to pass you back over to Stuart, and I think we're opening up for questions.
Thanks so much, Carla and Sean. If anyone does have any questions in the Q&A, please type it in the Q&A box. And whilst people are giving some thought to that, a question for both of you, if I may. So COP26, good COP, fair COP, or COP out? Carla, if you go first on that.
So you and I have already had discussions around this year, and I think I am veering towards COP out, but I do have reservations. For me, I think one of the things that was fascinating about COP26 was the way it first highlighted the issue of climate change and net zero in a way that we've never had before. I don't remember ever turning on the radio and hearing just net zero, COP26, environmental considerations mentioned time and time again. So it's fantastic. It's raised that consciousness. And also the smaller nations like Barbados, Bahamas, where their leaders gave some fantastic speeches and meant that they got on the map, and we're becoming more aware of the effects of climate change on them. But did we achieve what we all hoped we would? Not yet. I think it would have been great to see some bigger commitments, some more firm commitments, but I think it's a bit of a case of watch this space, but don't think that we don't have some responsibility for getting there as well. So on the fence, but probably veering to cop out.
Okay, thanks. And Sean, your thoughts?
I'd be very similar to Carla. I think overall, I absolutely agree. I was really pleased to see how the public engaged with this and the coverage it got across all ages. And whilst many people in the public didn't really understand what net zero really meant, they did understand the significance of if we don't do things and do it timely. I think there were some wins that we could have done which weren't undertaken, but perhaps we still have a period of time post-COP till the UK hands everything over to, I think, to Egypt later in 2022. So there's still a chance for the UK government maybe to go and engage and start some of that planning. And one of the key aspects I would like to have seen was the establishment of a kind of net zero acceleration centres distributed across in different countries, so we can accelerate a lot of that new knowledge and innovation that's coming forward, so we can actually get the foot on the gas with solutions. And perhaps there's some other areas which I'd like to see more work. But overall, I'm very pleased to engage the public as it did, because now it's going to be constantly on the agenda.
Okay, just thanks for that. So following on from that, if accepted, engage the public, my concern as someone who was just watching it from the outside is it perhaps didn't engage all of global leaders as it should do, and I think the outcomes were inevitably a fudge. Do either of you have any thoughts about what we could do either personally or in the context of our businesses, sort of notwithstanding the lack of guidance from COP26, as what should we all be doing next? Sean, maybe you could go first, and then Carla.
Well, certainly to what I've seen with discussions with chief execs, MDs of companies, they're not waiting on government. They are just putting the foot down where they can to drive forward to deliver net zero. And it's not just about shareholders or other things. I think ethically people really feel if they're going to do things that they've got the environment ahead of them and their future generations. So they want to make an effort now. Yes, some things will take time, but the good thing I think is people are not forgetting what was discussed and some of the gaps that were there. But the message to the governments would be probably, certainly from listening to some of the MDs and CEOs, the government is not moving fast enough. And I think some of the structures around some of those policies to come need to probably move at pace. So then, whilst industry might leap ahead and do some of that work, they also then want to move on a similar pipeline together. And that's how government can help channel that.
Thanks for that. Carla?
It's a really good question, Stuart. What can we each do as individuals? So thinking about corporations, it's ensuring you embed environmental, social and governance through your organization. And I know this isn't just about ESG, it's about net zero, but I think that all sort of fits together, making sure it's a topic that's on your agenda, making sure it's not just left to somebody in like a small facilities team, but it's actually on your radar and it's part of all your discussions, thinking about all the different things you can do. A good example from Mills and Reeve is that the brand chef in Cambridge, she doesn't allow any plastics into the cafeteria anymore. So everything is in glass bottles. The sandwich packaging says no plastics, and she's done that off her own back. So people can make small changes. As individuals, I think it's just being conscious of the choices we make, but I am also intensely aware that many things do come down to cost. So for a family, an electric car maybe is not affordable if you've got multiple children, you've got to do long journeys, etc. So it's incumbent on organizations to move in a direction that makes that more affordable and gives us those nudges so we are reducing our carbon footprint, maybe even without thinking about it.
So that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned cost, and Sean's got some either impressive or scary statistics about the cost of all of this and the number of homes that need to be modified each year to either 2045 or 2050. A question from our colleague Catherine Kay. It is the retrofitting market, and this is maybe one for Sean, and this is perhaps a bad phrase to use, a minefield, with ground source or air source heat pumps or microwaves, or changing insulation and heating. It seems that there's the idea sounds good in theory, but it seems quite difficult to put into practice. And you mentioned archetypes in your talk, and I was wondering, are those archetypes definitive enough to enable change to happen quite quickly, or is it still a long way off?
I think a lot of those solutions could come forward quite soon. The data is out there. It's harnessing the data into a central point. The construction industry has done this before, almost 20 years ago, when they needed specific data, and they rallied together and brought data together. But I think we must get over the line of people trying to deal with every building being absolutely individual. The vast majority of buildings in the UK will fall under specific build archetypes. They'll have specific heating requirements, and therefore there are specific fabric and energy solutions which could then be incorporated into them. And the sooner that we have an open guidance on those types of solutions for specific building archetypes that people live in, I think the faster and the better it will be easier for people to then identify, or whether there's small builders or retrofit contractors, the best mechanisms or solutions. Currently, the data is scattered around. It's a bit itty-bitty. You look at some of the data that has been provided on the costs for some remedials, and you think to yourself, well, not everybody lives in a detached house in London, and not everyone can afford £200,000 of retrofit. So I think we need to get really back to the brass tacks of where's the vast majority of the population living, in which archetypes. Let's get those solutions out there as soon as we can, with a mechanism by which we're then skilling up the colleges, skilling up our workforce, upskilling other people, and then we can roll out mass delivery. But importantly, our manufacturing supply chain know that if that system qualifies for that performance in that solution or that archetype, they can gear up too. So there's a series of chicken and egg scenarios going on that we've got to get those archetypes out first. Without them, we'll still be going at the pace we're at. And just finally, we have 26 million homes in the UK, just taking that stock alone. I think we've put in 370,000 air source heat pumps. At the current pace, and even if we double or triple it, it's still not going to be fast enough to deliver. So we also need to look at either acceleration or speeding up or bringing in other new innovations and solutions which can work.
Noted. Who pays for it?
I'll pass that one to Carla first.
Well, at the moment, it's probably the individuals, isn't it, or the companies, because it's not always affordable. But there are various grants for various things. So, for example, electric vehicles, there's grants to put in charging points in houses. So I guess it's hopefully in the future, there'll be more grants available. It'll be more cost effective. And especially with things like the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which is trying to make a number of things more affordable, such as green transport. So hopefully it won't come down just to the consumer, but I think at the moment it probably is consumer led, but watch the space again.
I think one of the areas that I'm quite keen on is that, I say keen, it's probably the wrong word. Some of our heavy industries will require to offset in the short term as they are developing solutions to reduce their carbon emissions on bigger scales. And I think there's potentially an opportunity here where the government could permit some larger scale offsetting in the short term, but those companies buy out that offsetting, as it were, those large companies. And then that fund could be used by the government as a retrofit fund towards housing or social housing, or increasing the grants available to private homeowners, etc. And therefore there's a sort of two-pronged approach. You're sort of enticing and accelerating, say to the heavy industries, okay, we will allow this, but you've got to get to year dot on this reduction. And in the meantime, you could buy out that carbon and we could channel it through these mechanisms into existing housing. And there's quite a significant carbon reduction for every home. And you start wrapping it up by millions or thousands or hundreds of thousands, and it really starts to make a significant impact very quickly. The vast majority of people will not be able to afford some of the retrofit measures which are required, so they're going to need support.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm conscious of time, so if it's okay, we'll stop the questions there. I think we've dealt with everything that's come in. A bit more for housekeeping. First, an advert for our next 2 construction webinars. On the 30th of November, Alex Hyke's going to look at ESG issues in construction projects, and on the 9th of December, Duncan Astle and Alison Garrett are going to consider health and safety. When the webinar is finished, there's a feedback form. We'd be grateful if people could complete it. It hopefully won't take up too much of your time. And do please suggest any topics which you would like us to address. And finally, on behalf of Carla, Sean, and me, thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy days to attend the webinar. So thank you very much, and goodbye.